Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd reporting from New York as we enter an unprecedented chapter in American history. And yes, the word unprecedented is going to get used all the time, but this is a case where there's no other word to choose. We're going down. Where we're going, there are no roads. Former president is now criminally charged for trying to overturn a presidential election he lost, even as he remains the overwhelming frontrunner to be his party's nominee for the next presidential election. It's the greatest stress test this country has faced, arguably, in over a century. Federal grand jury indicted Donald Trump yesterday afternoon as part of Special Counsel Jack Smith's investigation into January 6th and interference in the 2020 election. Trump was charged with 4 criminal counts: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights, essentially the rights of those who voted. Unlike the special counsel's previous indictment tied to classified documents, this time, Mr. Trump is being charged for conduct while he was in office. And unlike the last indictment, this one was publicly released for everyone to see almost immediately.
The attack on our nation's capital on January 6th, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election.
The scope of the conspiracy as laid out in the indictment is wide-ranging and sweeping. The indictment refers to 6 unnamed and unindicted co-conspirators who allegedly assisted Trump in his efforts to overturn the election and stay in power. Based on their descriptions, they appear to be Trump attorneys Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, who, of course, was the one trying to convince Mike Pence to obstruct the election returns, Sidney Powell, as well as former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark, and another attorney, Kenneth Chesbrough, also appears to be alleged co-conspirator number 5. We don't quite know who the 6th one is. Smith alleges the former president and his co-conspirators targeted 7 states he lost with a scheme to change their electoral votes through fake electors. One of the alleged co-conspirators even used the term fake electors to refer to them. The indictment lays out an instance after instance where Trump's hand-picked advisors in the Justice Department, the White House, and his own campaign repeatedly told him he'd lost, and they repeatedly debunked a specific conspiracy theory he would utter to them, whether it was one about Georgia, one about Michigan, one about Pennsylvania, etc. In other words, Trump knew he was lying and acting corruptly. He certainly was told what he was doing was breaking the law. It also alleges Trump tried to exploit the violence on January 6th as he remained intent on clinging to power. Of course, charging him with inciting the insurrection did not make it into this indictment. This morning, in a sit-down with NBC's Savannah Guthrie, Trump's attorney tried to argue that his client's conduct was protected by the First Amendment.
This is the first time that the First Amendment has been criminalized. It's the first time that a sitting president is attacking a political opponent on First Amendment grounds and basically making it criminal to state your position and to engage in political advocacy.
I've got to give you a little time out on that one because, of course,
we've never seen that before.
Well, the indictment specifically says that the president has a First Amendment right to speech.
Yes.
He even has a First Amendment right to lie. It says it right here.
Absolutely.
This indictment is criminalizing conduct, not speech.
Trump is set to be arraigned in Washington 24 hours from right now. But what happens then? When will he stand trial? Will he stand trial? What happens to the co-conspirators? Will any of them flip? Will any of them eventually get indicted? And, of course, there's the Republican primary and perhaps the general election. We're going to get to all of the political implications of the last 24 hours in just a bit. But we want to start with some of the most pressing legal questions in this historic case. So to get us started, joined by NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian, and then with our legal analysis, I got NBC News legal analyst Danny Sabalos, and Tim Hafey, a former U.S. attorney who served as the lead investigator for the January 6th committee. And, of course, they had their own criminal referrals that they sent to justice. So, Ken, let me start with you. I think that it was interesting to see the speed with which we got the indictment yesterday versus the classified documents indictment. I'm just curious, is this the special counsel's office sort of learning a lesson here? Boy, they allowed Trump to fill a vacuum for about half of a news cycle the first time. They didn't allow that this time.
I think that's a reasonable supposition, Chuck, although I will say there were some complexities in the classified documents rollout that didn't exist here. For example, they had to notify certain elements of the intelligence community about material that was going to be in the indictment, and they couldn't do it while it was sealed. So there were some things going on behind the scenes that delayed it. And it's also true, though, that they unsealed that indictment in Miami more quickly than they had planned to, as they realized that Donald Trump essentially had the floor. And it seems it seems certain that they were intent on making sure that didn't happen here, because you could just see the care with which they took to do the public rollout. It didn't go exactly as they had planned, but they got it out quickly. They had Jack Smith out. He didn't have to make a statement, but he did that. And the indictment is written in plain language, designed clearly to appeal to the American public as well as a jury. When you say, and it's very rare that you say in an indictment what a defendant had the right to do. They started with saying he had the right to say that the election was fraudulent. He even had the right to lie about it, but he didn't have the right to engage in an alleged criminal conspiracy, Chuck.
Yeah, that's interesting you point that out. You don't often see debate talking points in an indictment, is essentially what you're saying, right?
Exactly. So it really seemed written to persuade.
Anything else to glean from why Jack Smith chose to do an on-camera public statement? He didn't have a lot to say, but it seemed like the symbolism was somewhat mattered to them.
It feels to me like they really believe there is a public education function that they need to do here, that this isn't just, they're not just speaking to the legal community and the potential jury pool, but to the public writ large. And it was also a kind of a concerted effort to make sure Merrick Garland had his say as well. He was at a public appearance in Philadelphia. There were cameras there. He answered a question. He essentially asserted Jack Smith's independence, even though, of course, Merrick Garland has been briefed on this case all along, and he had a chance to block this indictment. He chose not to. But I thought all that was interesting, and it was all by design.
Couple of quick things. One, do we feel like we have a good idea of who's fully cooperating and who isn't? I mean, I assume now with Mark Meadows being portrayed very honestly, at least in the indictment, hard not to think he's not cooperating, correct?
Well, no, I'll tell you, we do not have an idea. That is unknowable, really. But and because I'll tell you this, cooperating could mean different things. Mark Meadows may be cooperating in the sense that he is complying with grand jury subpoenas and turning over everything that he's supposed to turn over. Or it's possible that he or others could have cut a deal and be, and be subject to criminal prosecution and are cooperating in that respect. Those are two different things, and we really don't know if there are anybody in that category out there, that there are sealed criminal informations with actual cooperators who are, under the gun with criminal prosecution. We don't know the answer to that. It's certainly plausible, though, and it's plausible that some of these co-conspirators could take a look at the charges arrayed, potential charges arrayed against them, and decide to cut a deal themselves.
There's a little bit of action in the other Jack Smith indictment and investigation. He's asked for a hearing in the classified documents case in front of the Florida judge on conflict of interest issues with one of the defense attorneys. Walk us through it.
Right. So it's a man named Stan Woodward, who has represented a number of different people in various of these investigations, and his bills appear to be paid by the Trump super PAC. So that's important to know. And the special counsel is raising an issue of potential conflict of interest because essentially he may end up cross-examining his own client on behalf of another client, and that's a problem. There's also an issue with he's representing people who appear to that the special counsel would badly want to cooperate, but they are so far remaining loyal to former President Trump as their lawyers' bills.
So what is he hoping for from the judge? That the judge is going to say he can't represent all of these folks at the same time? He wants the judge to force this issue?
That's possible, although I heard Andrew Weissman say today that this may be a waivable conflict of interest if the client says that's okay. But look, I feel like the special counsel feels like they have to pursue this remedy just to make sure that it's on the record. All
right, Ken Delanian, getting us started on the Justice Beat for us. Ken, thank you. All right, I got the prosecution side essentially and the defense side here represented with Tim Hafey, who assisted the January 6th committee, former U.S. attorney himself, and, of course, Danny Ceballos, who's made his living as a defense attorney here as well. So I'm going to try to get you guys on to sort of stay in those lanes for this. So, Tim, let me start with you. The the criminal referrals you guys made, January 6th committee made to justice, you feel pretty vindicated by what Jack Smith turned in yesterday?
Yeah, look, the facts have been obvious, Chuck, for a long time. The special counsel relied on the same facts and reached the same conclusion that we did, that those facts give rise to the violation of several federal criminal statutes. Obstruction of an official proceeding and conspiracy to defraud the United States were precisely the statutes that we referenced in our criminal referral. Not a surprise, right? Facts make cases, evidence wins trials, not lawyers. And the facts have been fairly obvious here for some time.
It seems like if he got additional information, it was arguably because he seemed to have a few more tools. I want to look at the Marc Meadows excerpt in the indictment, and I'm just curious if how much you wish you could have gotten more from Meadows. A day after the defendant's chief of staff personally observed the signature verification process, the Cobb County Civic Center notified the defendant that state election officials were conducting themselves in exemplary fashion and would find fraud if it existed. The defendant, meaning Donald Trump, tweeted that the Georgia officials administering the signature verification process were trying to hide evidence of election fraud and were, and then brackets, terrible people. What were the tools that Jack Smith, do you think, had that got more out of Marc Meadows than you guys were able to?
Yeah, so when there's a criminal investigation in a grand jury proceeding, any assertion of privilege can be immediately adjudicated by the chief judge. Marc Meadows, as you know, sort of halfway cooperated with us. He gave us a lot of text messages, were really important, but then refused to come in and submit to the deposition, even though he'd been subpoenaed, claiming executive privilege. Essentially, his argument was, look, as White House chief of staff, I am immune from congressional oversight and don't have to submit to the select committee. Our only option was civil litigation, which takes a while. We did not have the time because we were on a time clock. We were expiring at the end of the Congress to take that claim to a judge. We thought it was meritless, but we did not have the enforcement ability. Jack Smith goes right upstairs to the chief judge who supervises the grand jury, and that judge immediately makes a ruling. He hears from Meadows' lawyer, he hears from the special counsel, and he makes a call, and then it immediately goes to the Court of Appeals on a motion to stay. So he has that hammer to sort of quickly push through privilege assertions, and he has used that effectively to get access to information that we did not have.
All right, Dana, let me bring you in here. When you read this indictment, as Trump's defense attorney, do you think is the toughest part of this indictment for him to fight?
Let's start with the facts. Not a lot in the way of facts is a surprise to any of us. So for those of us who have been following along, there aren't a lot of surprises in the indictment. So knowing that, the hardest part of the case has always been what it was for at least the last year, since the January 6th committee elicited a lot, if not most, of the facts that we see in the indictment. So the real question, the only question remaining, was whether or not Jack Smith's team thought those known facts fit into particular federal statutes. And so now we see that obviously they do. I think any federal case is a bad case for any defendant because the vast majority of federal cases end in conviction. But I think for me, the most damning thing for Trump, if you think about this from a defense attorney's standpoint, everything goes to his intent ultimately. And then also there's a defense that, hey, these are my minions, my buffers. They acted independently of me. I didn't know what they were doing. But really at the core of this, all Trump really has is an intent defense. And so we see them, the government, refute that in the list of people that told him that this was a bad idea.
If there was not such an organized elector scheme, right? Take that out of it. Do you think his First Amendment defense would be stronger?
Sure. I mean, the elector scheme is the most concrete to me. And really,
that, to me, is what makes this, to me, so much harder for him to use a First Amendment defense.
Exactly right. But then again, the elector scheme has a lot of people working at Trump's behest. You have your Giulianis, right? You have even people working with Giuliani. You have a lot of folks that Trump might point to and say, hey, that Giuliani guy, he was a rogue actor. I didn't know what he was doing out there. I don't even understand the government.
This is what Trump did to Michael Cohen.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, so why wouldn't, is the best defense, it's funny, he's worried about people flipping on him. Should he flip against his co-conspirators?
By flip, you mean, can he go into the government and enter into a cooperation agreement? The government's not interested in that. Number one, he's the only defendant. Right. So there's no one really right now for him technically to cooperate against. The government wouldn't be interested in that. I expect if he went into the government would give him an offer that I've gotten plenty of times, which is your client can plead to the indictment. In other words, he can walk into court. We won't make any recommendation. He pleads to everything in the indictment. Sometimes in federal court, it's so bad that is an option, but that's not going to happen in this case. Not a chance. So, look, I mean, Trump is going to blame other people, right? But the government knows that, and he's also going to claim massive ignorance. But again, the government knows that, and that's why they have all those facts in there about all the people that told him what was going on. But look for him to, those Rudy Giuliani and electors part of it, look for him to say that was Rudy operating on his own.
Tim, when you've brought a set of charges, look, more people other than Donald Trump committed crimes here, as alleged in this indictment. But Jack Smith chose to single out Donald Trump and not, and it is... How often have you done that? And is that done simply to get a speedier trial?
It's rare. Usually you want to charge all the conspirators together in a single indictment. You don't want to try the same case or present duplicative evidence in multiple trials. The difference here is the DOJ policy about refraining from taking any enforcement action anywhere close to an election. They have the target of this investigation, the defendant is running for president, and therefore there is some haste to bring this case, take this action well in advance of when people start voting. My guess is those other conspirators are not off the hook. There may be subsequent cases. Some of them may end up evaluating exposure and potentially reaching some sort of a deal. Very hard to say. Very common in conspiracy cases for conspirators themselves to end up being witnesses against others, as your questions, Danny, were just suggesting. So this is not the end of the proceedings here. It's really just the beginning.
And Tim, were you surprised that incitement wasn't included or not?
You know, that raises more of the First Amendment defense, right? Speech is protected by the Constitution, as it should be, but conduct is not. That's the line that the jury will have to draw. If President Trump stands up and says the election was stolen, and that's his right. It's only if he says that as part of a scheme to actually take action to disrupt the joint session, the transfer of power, that it becomes criminal. So the incitement statute, you know, aid and comfort to an insurrection, those are vague terms that do get closer to speech. I think he's charged this surgically, looking for a speedy trial, avoiding some of those legal issues is the best chance of getting this resolved before the election.
Danny, how would you try to avoid a speedy trial here? I mean, he's made it hard. What's your sense of how likely Trump is going to be able to delay this until after
There's a paradox going on here. The speedy trial rule is designed to protect defendants. But in federal court, often the speedy trial rule can be better for the government. It's no surprise to me that Jack Smith, a man of few words, found a way to crowbar in the word speedy trial in his very short statement, because a speedy trial benefits the government, particularly in a case like this, where they've been investigating for years. Admittedly, Jack Smith started in, I believe, November of last year, but they've been investigating for a long time. Meanwhile, the defense hasn't gotten discovery document number 1. So in a strange situation here, although not that strange, the government is ready to go to trial probably tomorrow. It's the defense that needs time. So this is a case where speedy trial would inure to the benefit of the government. That's why they're going to try and essentially enforce the defendant's rights.
Sure, but what's Trump's best tactic to delay this?
Look, argue that the case is unusually complex. The Speedy Trial Act allows for a delay. But I've had judges that when you make that argument, they say, OK, fine. And they move the trial out 1 month. Gee, thanks. You know, that's not a lot of help. Federal judges like to keep their docket moving very quickly. This is not state court where congestion will lead to delays of a century. Cases move quickly in federal court.
Danny Savalos, Tim Hafey, I got a lot more questions, but I don't have enough time right now. But I think we're going to hear from both of you a lot, I hope. Thank you guys for helping us navigate this indictment. We got an update on some news that had been breaking over the last hour on Capitol Hill. It was a bit disturbing. Multiple Senate office buildings had to be evacuated after D.C. police received a 911 call claiming there was an active shooter in the Hart Senate office building. Well, moments ago, U.S. Capitol Police held a press briefing on the incident, saying all 3 Senate office buildings have been cleared, and they found nothing concerning, adding that it was likely a bogus call. Police are now trying to trace the call. We should note both chambers of Congress are in recess. So, of course, the folks being targeted here were the staffers. We got a lot more to unpack this hour. Up next, handwritten notes, an unrelenting pressure campaign, and an angry mob. We got some new revelations tied to Mike Pence in this indictment and what Donald Trump told him about interfering in the 2020 election. I got Mike Pence's former chief of staff and a grand jury witness himself, Marc Short, joining me next. Welcome back. Now let's turn now to the political fallout, where former Vice President Mike Pence spoke to reporters for the first time while out in the campaign trail about the latest criminal charges against his former running mate, including Donald Trump's efforts to get Mike Pence to violate the Constitution and stop Congress from certifying the results on January 6th.
I want the American people to know that I had no right to overturn the election. And then on that day, President Trump asked me to put him over the Constitution. But I chose the Constitution, and I always will. I mean, I really do believe that anyone who puts themselves over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. And anyone who asks someone else to put themselves over the Constitution should never be president of the United States again. I can't assess whether or not the government has the evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what they assert in the indictment. And the president's entitled to a presumption of innocence. But for my part, I want people to know that I had no right to overturn the election.
So very animated Vice President Mike Pence there. The special counsel's indictment includes some new revelations tied to Mike Pence, including the full extent of Trump's pressure campaign to convince him to unconstitutionally reject the certification of electoral votes. In one interaction that the indictment recounts, the vice president responded to Trump that he thought there was no constitutional basis for such authority and that it was improper. In response, Trump told the vice president, "You're too honest." We also learned that Pence was documenting some of his interactions with President Trump leading up to January 6th in real time. The indictment points to a January 4th meeting, stating, during the meeting, as reflected in the vice president's contemporaneous notes, the defendant made knowingly false claims of election fraud, including, quote, bottom line, won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes, and, quote, we won every state. The former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence, Marc Short, was in that meeting. He has testified before the grand jury, and he's agreed to join us right here. Mr. Short, thank you for coming on.
Chuck, thanks for having me.
So let me start with the former vice president and what we learned about his note-taking. Was this something he started doing in that period of the pressure campaign, or is this something he was doing quite often?
As you can imagine, the job of Vice President of the United States is a pretty overwhelming position, and there's a lot of information that flows through any single one day. So he would often take notes just to keep facts straight over time. And I think that much of his book and his memoir, So Help Me God, he used those notes to help with the writing of the book. And I think, the special counsel then subpoenaed those notes, and therefore he complied with that subpoena.
Is the vice president sort of resigned to the fact that if there's a trial, he's likely to be one of the most important witnesses for the government?
I don't know, Chuck. I mean, I don't know exactly how these prosecutions go. I do think that I don't think there's much question about what the facts were about the president's pressure campaign with the vice president. It seems that more of the allegations are on the conspiracy and what the president knew or didn't know. And so I don't know. I don't know if he will be or if I will be or others will be called to be witnesses yet.
The former vice president told me he thought that former President Trump was led astray by his lawyers, many of whom are those unindicted co-conspirators. In fact, let me play what he said to me.
The first time I heard in early December somebody suggest that as vice president I might be able to decide which votes to reject and which to accept, I knew that it was false. Sadly, the president was surrounded by a group of crackpot lawyers that kept telling him what his itching ears wanted to hear.
Do you think that, given everything we've learned now, the president just sat there and let these crackpot lawyers do this? I mean, he had no involvement here whatsoever. Is that really the defense here?
Well, I don't think so, Chuck. I do think he had some crazy-ass lawyers around him, but I think there's no doubt he sought them out. But I don't think in any way is the vice president exonerated him. He's been pretty clear and open that what the president asked him to do was a violation of his oath to protect the country, and he was asking the vice president to violate his oath to the Constitution on the day of January 6th. But I got to say, what I think has been the most remarkable thing in the last 24 hours is, in essence, the president's team putting forward the First Amendment defense. Because I don't know, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and maybe they're right that, you know, if you're going to prosecute people for false information, then you'd have to prosecute Democrat elected officials too. But that's a giant shift from 2.5 years of telling the American people the election was stolen. I have the facts. I just never got to present my case because Congress wouldn't hear it or the courts wouldn't hear it. If that was the case, he could walk in now and present it and the conspiracies would go away. But if instead they're saying, look, everyone has a First Amendment right to mislead the American people, well, then obviously he's been misleading the American people and misleading about what the vice president's role was.
So what you're saying is that he can't have it both ways. He can't have his First Amendment rights and at the same time somehow question what Mike Pence did with false information.
Exactly, Chuck. I mean, again, maybe he does have a First Amendment right to mislead the American people. And look, we're in the nation's capital where there are plenty of elected officials who do that. I accept that. But then you're making the point that I have been misleading the American people for the last 2.5 years, if that's my defense. And it's not really that I really thought all this information was true and the vice president had this authority that no other vice president in 250 years of our republic has ever used, nor one that we would want Kamala Harris to have in 2024 to unilaterally throw out states and in that certification.
To me, the most powerful part of the indictment was the tick-tock on the elector scheme, because we can have a debate about what did he believe, what didn't he believe. This was an action that was taken on his behalf. What was your awareness of how aggressive this electoral vote strategy was? When did you become aware of just how extensive it was?
You know, Chuck, I even kind of to this day question the extensiveness of it. In my mind, there were a lot of people throwing mud at the wall or trying to see what would stick, and it was not really a real thought-out strategy. The vice president, as you remember, was traveling the country trying to encourage states to reopen as the leader of the COVID task force. The vice president went to Georgia 6 different times campaigning for those 2 special elections. And so many of those meetings that I guess were happening to elicit false electors were done really without our office's knowledge or the vice president's knowledge. And so it wasn't really until the last day or two that we became really more aware of that. And interestingly, you know, the vice president asked the Senate parliamentarian on January 3rd about alternate sets of electors, and they said, you know, we get them. Every average citizen will send them in every 4 years.
Sure.
But it means nothing. It means nothing unless the state has certified them. And so the question is, have other states certified? If you go back to the vice president's remarks on presiding over that ceremony, he would say no other slate having been certified by their state, you know, he then moves forward to go ahead with the proceedings.
Up till now, Republican voters have not been moved by these allegations. What do you think? Why do you think that is? And do you think there's a way for their minds to change? Because if they do, Mike Pence might be their guy.
Maybe, Chuck. I don't know. I think that the reality is that each indictment has rallied Republican supporters around the president. And I think that fairly, for a lot of Republicans, they look back on those 4 years as a lot that was accomplished in a conservative agenda that they're really proud of and believe that, you know, Donald Trump was defending a lot of our beliefs from attack from the left. And so there's sort of a built-in, I think, sense from Republicans that he's under attack now. We're going to defend him. And I think that, you know, that's understandable. And I think there was a lot that was great that was accomplished that he deserves credit for. But having said that, you know, I think that the events of January 6th were absolutely tragic. And I think the president had an enormous dereliction of duty on that day and the days leading up to it.
Is this disqualifying in your mind?
In my mind, it is. Sure. I mean, I think if you basically are president of the United States and you willfully ask your vice president to disregard his oath to the Constitution, I think that is disqualifying for whether you're conservative or liberal. But I think that you know, that is a decision for American voters to make moving forward.
You've spoken with both the January 6th committee and with the grand jury. Obviously, you can't disclose the grand jury process specifically. I get that. But I'm just curious, the difference, what was similar, what was the same? How would you compare the two experiences?
Well, I wouldn't wish them on anyone, Chuck. I mean, I think in both cases I was subpoenaed before that testimony, but I think that in each case that the people leading those hearings were incredibly professional with us, and I think we told our story and leave it up to others to judge whether or not there's events that can be prosecuted from them.
Jack Smith did not charge the former president with incitement. In some ways, I think agreeing with the potential First Amendment argument on that front. But he did allege that Donald Trump exploited the violence. Is that something you and the vice president would agree with?
Well, I don't want to speak for the vice president. I think, as I was there in the Capitol that day, that I would certainly agree with that. I think that the president did encourage people to march to the Capitol, but I don't think you can hold him at fault for the violence that occurred. I think that the people who conducted the violence are the ones that merit that. But, when in the midst of the violence happening, when the president is tweeting out derogatory and inflammatory and false information about the vice president in the midst of that, I think he bears responsibility for that, sure.
We're going to have a lot of trials and a lot of hearings, and it's all going to happen. I don't know if the legal calendar is now the primary calendar or vice versa. I'm being a little facetious here. But how damaging do you think this could be to the Republican Party if the voters decide to stick with Trump?
Well, I think that what we saw in 2020 is that probably Donald Trump is one of the only ones in the Republican field who could not beat Joe Biden in 2024. And so I think it is something the Republican voters have to come to grips with. And I think there's a bigger question about where our party is headed. I think, again, there was much that was accomplished in those 4 years that is tremendous for conservatives. Whether or not it was reshaping the court, rebuilding our military, getting the tax reform, and securing our border, things that we fought for many years that we can be proud of. But at the same time, the end does not justify the means. And I think if we basically embrace the notion that we can disregard the rule of law when it's in our interest, then I think that that's a bigger challenge for our party moving forward.
Had enough senators voted to convict, would that have been the better outcome?
I don't know, Chuck. I think I have a lot of concerns about whether or not it's appropriate for people to be voting to impeach a president after the term is completed and he doesn't have the ability to defend himself in that proceeding. I think there would have been a lot of due process concerns with that. And so I think the Senate acted appropriately in not impeaching the president.
All right. Or convicting on that front. Marc,
Thank you.
That's all right. Former chief of staff to, and still a political advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks,
sharing
Chuck.
your experiences with us. Good to talk with you. Still ahead, a deeper dive in what these charges could mean for the Trump campaign standing in the polls and his bank account. I got Steve Kornacki at the big board. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Indictments in New York and the classified documents case did little to knock former President Trump from his frontrunner status in the Republican primary. And while it's a bit too early to say for sure that this indictment is going to move the needle, probably won't. Most of Trump's 2024 rivals are as reluctant as ever to criticize him, though they're not embracing this one as closely this time. It's interesting. His closest runner-up, Ron DeSantis, said he'd end the weaponization of government as president, and Vivek Ramaswamy called on the field to stand with Trump.
Well, one of the reasons I'm running for president, Harris, is to reconstitutionalize the federal government and these agencies that have become weaponized, the FBI, the DOJ, against political opponents. Do we have a single standard of justice, or do we have a track of justice where if you're connected to the swamp, you get off, whether it's Hunter Biden, whether it was the guy Durham tried to prosecute, or are we going to live under a single rule of law?
It would be easier for me if Donald Trump were eliminated from competition. That is not how any of us should want to win, because that is bad for this country. That is why I think it's important for those of us competing against Trump to take a strong stand against these politicized indictments.
And joining me now from where else? The big board is NBC's senior national political correspondent, Steve Kornacki. So, Steve, we've seen the polling bumps before. And I don't know whether at this point we would consider them a bump or this just what it is. But we've never seen evidence that these indictments hurt Trump yet.
Yeah, we've seen it help him in a big way, and we've seen just the what you're saying there, that it didn't hurt him. So overall, if you just average the polls together right now, that's where Trump is running on the Republican side, almost 40 points over his nearest competitor, Ron DeSantis, nobody else in double digits. And here's the trend line this year. Trump is this blue line at the top, DeSantis is the orange line under. And you can really see, it's hard to remember now, but earlier in the year, DeSantis was relatively close to Trump, coming off that bad 22 midterm for the Republican Party, but the good one for DeSantis. And then it was right here at the end of March, Trump was indicted in Manhattan in the Stormy Daniels money case, and that's where his numbers shot up. That's where DeSantis fell. And yeah, you could see a couple other developments, the E. Jean Carroll trial, the indictment in the documents case. His numbers have basically been stable since. So the first time he got a huge boost, moved over 50%, moved 25, 30 points ahead of DeSantis. And that's been status quo since.
I've had multiple Republicans come on the show and say Alvin Bragg is Donald Trump's secret weapon, that indictment did it. They're not sure about the others. It is interesting to me to see the fundraising reports. These aren't polls. We can't tell you that but if we're seeing fatigue among donors with these indictments, one can't help but wonder if it will eventually translate into public opinion. But show us that.
Yeah, so here, a similar sort of timeline here. And what you're looking at here are the contributions to Trump's campaign. And you can see, again, where this is that period we're talking about here. The indictment in New York by Alvin Bragg. Then it was, a few days later, there, April 4th, he was actually arrested and arraigned. The big media spectacle raised in that one day nearly $4 million, $3.9 million in that one day. And you can see in the subsequent, the arraignment in Florida, the indictment that came right before that. This was on the Mar-a-Lago documents case. I think it was a 1.3 million on the day of his arraignment here. So you're talking about 1/3. He was arraigned in Manhattan early April, nearly 4 million. Arraigned in Florida, the documents case, 1.3 million. Now, we'll see on this one is the nature of this indictment, the seriousness of it, all of that. Is that going to trigger something else?
It's notable.
But it is less.
It is notable on the Florida run because they seem to almost try harder to make money off of Florida. They put more effort into creating an event out of Florida. New York, they seem to shy away from it. That happened organically. They try to make it work, and it didn't happen as well.
You wonder with these things, too. I think it's the story of Trump for 8 years now. The first time something happens, you get all the coverage of it's unprecedented. We've never seen it. And that may have been what we saw with Manhattan and the DA.
Very quickly, if we're looking for a group of Republicans in the electorate to watch to see which way they're moving, what group are you looking for?
Evangelicals in Iowa. I mean, I think if anybody's going to catch Trump, they've got to start in Iowa. And
so if those folks are somehow offended by these things, then all of a sudden maybe there's a path.
2/3 of the Iowa electorate is going to be evangelical Christian. Trump almost finished third in Iowa in 2016. He's 30 points ahead now. But, I mean, that's where you got to see movement if you're another Republican.
Boy, that is not an electorate that we've seen a lot of movement in, has it? All right. Steve, great stuff.
You got it.
So joining me now is Dasha Burns with all what this might mean for the Republican primary. And Dasha, you just heard Steve there. He basically said, I said, all right, what's the one group of voters I guess we should watch right now to see if they'll move at all? And it's sort of your theory, which is, well, let's check the Iowa stuff. It's the Iowa evangelical. If they move, okay, then maybe voters are going to start moving. But you've been on the trail.
Yeah.
Does January 6th move the needle? We know that classified documents doesn't, and we know Stormy Daniels doesn't with the Republican base. What about the January 6th business?
Well, when I talk to voters, there are sort of two camps here. And I'm talking Republican primary voters.
Right, and you've been in Iowa, New Hampshire, in all these early states.
For Trump, there's a reason that he cannot let go of this issue of election interference. And that is because for his red meat base, it is what brings people to life. And it is what sort of lights up that very uncanny, completely unparalleled connection that he has with his voters. We have never seen anything like that with any.
The election misinformation is the key ingredient.
It reminds people of the club that they're in and the club that got snubbed by everybody else. On the other hand, the people that aren't fully in that club, that don't have their gold card, right?
But they don't like us in the media, and we'll be with Trump if you tell us not to.
That's
what
right.
about that?
That's right. But then the other folks, The January 6th issue is the one where they'll say he was a fantastic president. We love so much of what he did. But that's the one, I don't know about that day. I've even talked to voters that have said I was with him until January 6th. And that could be the crux. But at the same time,
are there enough of them?
I don't know that there are enough of them. I also don't know that people are paying enough attention because this is indictment number 3. And I think either for the folks that love Trump, they've written it all off, or people are so tired of the indictments that they're like, you know what? We need to get past this legal stuff. Let's talk about the kitchen table issues.
Do you have any sense that DeSantis or Tim Scott or Nikki Haley? I know what Christie and others are doing here, and Pence, but I'm talking about the 3 right now that might have the best shot at knocking them off. Do you get the sense that any of them want to dabble in this?
DeSantis left himself a window. He said in his statement, I haven't read the indictment.
That was interesting.
Yeah. Weaponization of the department. He's a guy that loves to read, so I'm curious what he'll say and if and when he does.
It's a great read.
Read this. It's a compelling
Governor,
read.
whatever you think of it, it's a good read.
It's a good read. So he might be leaving himself some wiggle room there. I mean, if he's his closest rival, you're in a Republican primary.
I found his statement to be, it wasn't as supportive of Trump as you might have thought.
And it came a little quicker than it did last time, too.
Yes, it did. Dasha Burns. Okay. Let's see what they think now. Right. How do you like them now?
Back to Iowa soon, Jack.
All right, Republican lawmakers in Washington are once again coming to the former president's defense after this latest indictment. Speaker Kevin McCarthy called the indictment an attempt by the Justice Department to distract from investigations into Hunter Biden and anybody else that may be associated with Hunter. Elise Stefanik, the number 3 House Republican, called the indictment a sham and reiterated the GOP talking point that Biden is weaponizing the Department of Justice against a political rival. And the House Judiciary Committee chairman and ardent supporter of Donald Trump, Jim Jordan, tweeted, quote, President Trump did nothing wrong. So joining me now is John Kasich. He's the former Ohio governor, 2016 presidential candidate. He's now an NBC News analyst. And, Governor Kasich, after reading the indictment, I'm curious what you thought, because here we are. We're going to go through an election now where the rule of law is on the ballot. And we had a venue where we could have resolved this, but the Republican Party chose not to use it. And that was called the impeachment trial. When you look at this indictment, where would we be as a country had Mitch McConnell gone the other way?
Oh, that's impossible for me to kind of answer, Chuck. I guess it would have made it would have sent a message to Republicans by Republican leaders that Trump is not acceptable. So it probably would have been maybe not a knockout, but a knockdown punch. And I was interested in the question you were asking, buddy, about who should you keep an eye on? Chuck, I mean, look, you have your solid Trumpers. They're, 30, 35, 37%. But you have 2 other groups. You've got the never Trumpers, and you've got those people who are kind of like, I probably would vote for Trump. The person who would be able to unify those 2, and they're hard to do because the never Trumpers are never Trump. And those who kind of like, who kind of are for Trump, they don't want you tearing his skin off. So how do you bring those 2 together? That's the best chance. That's what I would watch, are those people who kind of, I might go for Trump, but, I really don't like him. That's the group I would keep my eye on.
So, but I guess the question I have is, are there too many always Trumpers? And what I mean by that is they're so always Trump that if it's not Trump, they're out. And what's your, there's a lot of people in the Republican Party fear losing his most ardent supporters in a general versus, putting together the coalition you were just talking about.
Chuck, you're going to run for president, you got to be who you are. And I think that that person that can thread that needle, or somebody that can become formidable, and then all of a sudden everybody's talking about him. The other thing that hasn't been said here is, with all of Trump's legal problems mounting, I mean, everywhere you look around, there's another indictment. Could we get to the point where Trump says, I'm going to cut a deal? And if he cut a deal, he would have some excuse as to why he did it. I'm not saying he's going to do it. I'm not predicting it. But I think it's a real possibility that isn't being considered right now. Yeah, he says there's no way I'm going to quit. Oh, really? With all these things staring him in the face? I wouldn't discount that possibility. And then who picks up the pieces, we're going to have to see.
Better for the country to have these trials before the election or not?
Well, look, I mean, the judicial system should work, Chuck, the way it works. Now, lawyers have their chance. The people who are being defended have an opportunity to do what they do. But I think that justice has to be seen here in all these things. That's my sense of it. And however that legal business plays out, I mean, what's best for the country? Justice is what's best for the country. Yeah. Not that there's some slipshod. Look, we keep talking about, who's the best candidate? How should they position themselves? What's best for why don't we just figure out what's best for the country and go for that? Instead of all the machinations about what politically work and doesn't work and with this poll and that poll. That's not what makes great leaders.
But
great leaders get made through a crucible of challenge.
The problem is that I think the country thinks what's in their best interest is not to have either Biden or Trump run, and neither man is going to abide by that.
Well, and that's why you see the rise of the potential, not the third, I guess not a third party, but a third party, or a third movement, which is, this no labels. And one of the things that's interesting is I'm told that the Democrats predominantly are the ones that want to keep them off the ballot. So they're the ones that don't like voter suppression, but they're having some voter suppression when it comes to whether no labels can get on.
Yeah.
Change is coming, Chuck. It's coming.
Well, and that's the point. I was trying to make this point on Sunday is I don't think the general public who doesn't live and breathe this the way you and I do is fully appreciative. I mean, my own 19-year-old daughter said to me the other day, wait, it's going to be Biden and Trump again? And she just was like, it didn't compute. And she has to, she's in college. She's not total osmosis these days, but what does that moment look like on May 1st, right? Where the Republican Party nominated, and all of a sudden we have these trials, right? What do you expect the public's reaction to be?
Chuck, I guess, the bulk of the country is going to say they don't want Trump. I don't think there's any way Trump could ever be president. I think we've made up our minds. Voters have made up their minds. And I think if it's Trump and Biden, Biden will do better than he did the last time. For those people who are Trumpers, Chuck, I keep going back to this conversation I had with this gentleman, very smart guy. I said, well, what would change your mind about Trump? He said, nothing, because I don't believe any of the elites. I don't believe the news media. I don't believe anybody else. And as far as I'm concerned, he's fine. So you make a good point about not just your daughter, but a lot of people. They're not riveted to all this stuff. They see this happening. They shake their heads. And remember, 17% of Republicans in that last poll that I think NBC was connected to said that Trump has done something that's seriously wrong. 17%. The last time I checked, it's like 83% think, well, he didn't do anything wrong. So with Republicans, we just got to see the water that goes under the bridge. I think that anytime you're indicted, it's bad for you. But the question is, where are those voters in terms of not just never Trump, but those who are kind of semi-sticky to him? That's what I would watch.
I know where you keep coming back to, which is, we know the country doesn't want this, but how do you have that, I can't take it anymore conversation with a large electorate in our siloed society?
Well, this is a big problem because, as you know, Republicans look at Democrats as an existential threat to their way of life. Democrats take a look at the Supreme Court decisions, and they're saying Republicans are an existential threat to our country. Both sides. And there's not everybody searching for this middle. There isn't a lot of middle. There's people that look at this for various reasons. And I think that a lot of them are cultural about the other side being an existential threat. We have to get out of it. I think we get out of it two ways. When normal people go to the bowling alley and they're hanging out together and they're getting to know each other and it starts a conversation. But secondly, you're going to think this is out there. I think just like we saw in the turn of the 20th century, we're going to need some sort of a spiritual awakening where people look at people that they don't agree with, realize that they're all made in the image of God and that they have to have respect for them. And until that happens, we stay in this position where you're in one place and I'm in another, and I don't like you and you don't like me, and you represent something that destroys my way of life. That's dangerous and sad.
The most striking poll number I've seen recently is a majority of people don't trust other people. And that gets to what you're saying. We have to want to build community again. And until we do that, we may not break this cycle.
Chuck, we used to always say, let me make one other point here. We used to say that a cataclysmic event could change things.
Yeah.
COVID was, and it made us even more polarized.
It changed things. This not
But
the
I'm
right way.
optimistic. We'll get there.
I know
You
you
never count out the big guy to give us the inspiration we need to bring us together.
I always count on the son of a mailman. I do. I do. I miss you, buddy. John Kasich, always good to see you, my friend.
I miss you, Chuck. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Well, the alarm bells going off over the United States credit rating being downgraded and how January 6th apparently played into the decision. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We are tracking some major economic news that sort of got overshadowed by the big indictment, and it does actually have January 6 ties. Fitch, which is one of three major credit rating agencies, has downgraded the U.S.'s credit rating, citing, quote, erosion of governance on fiscal and debt-related matters. It marks the first major downgrade since the 2011 debt ceiling standoff. The agency cited the January 6 insurrection as an area of concern for U.S. governance. Earlier this year, Fitch put the U.S. rating on a negative watch during the political fight over the debt ceiling. So let me bring in NBC News business and data reporter Brian Chung. Brian, it's interesting to me. It just goes back to you could say we've had governance issues going all the way back to 2011.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Okay. You could say we've had some issues of our Constitution and our political stability with January 6th. The debt ceiling standoff got resolved, and it still ended up in a downgrade?
Yeah, and that's the reason why you hear from Janet Yellen saying that she thinks that this was an arbitrary move. I mean, especially for it to have happened 2 months after we avoided going off the cliff in the debt ceiling negotiations. What Fitch is trying to say is it's a culmination of all of these things. So they didn't declare it after January 6th. They didn't declare it immediately after the debt ceiling standoff because they wanted to see the totality of the situation. Can the government not only get on one page in terms of avoiding this in the future, but also deal with the debt issue independently, because we know that there are concerns with an aging population, Chuck. Can we pay our Social Security bills in the future? So the totality of all that is the reason why Fitch says they had to downgrade the U.S.
So we're no longer this super AAA rating, automatic AAA rating, because if you do the combination, right? We don't have AAA across the board. What does that mean to the average consumer?
Well, to the average consumer, nothing.
Okay.
I mean, I think that when it comes to these debt ratings, it's really all about even financial markets. And it's interesting to see, you heard from Jamie Dimon on CNBC, the head of the largest bank in the country. He says, I don't really think this matters because financial markets still hold U.S. Treasuries, which is American debt, as the highest. So even though Canada, Switzerland are rated above the United States,
I was just going to say, so Canada and Switzerland are above us.
They are among those countries that are rated above us, but people still think United States government debt is more worthy than those other ones.
Where this does seem to impact is that there are some, is it pension funds that they can only invest in certain AAA credit debt? Is that where this comes in even at all?
Yeah, there was a Goldman Sachs note that talked about this. In many cases, there are some covenants that say you have to be in AAA rated debt. In most cases, though, you're going to see more covenants that are similar to the tune of the most highly rated debt, which means that could still include
that could still include the United States. When would Fitch redo this if they wanted to?
They could look at it again in the next few years. But again, S&P never re-rated it, so worth remembering.
And it's worth remembering. Brian Chung, thank you for some clarification there. Thank you all for being with us this hour. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.